Morality and decision-making are key themes of The Witcher 3, the fate of many characters and events being settled through the choices you make as the player. That's the cornerstone of The Witcher 3's overall experience and replayability. A lot of these decisions come down to either personal preference or what the player thinks Geralt as a character might actually do. After all, you're in his shoes. Some repercussions are minor, others more significant, having a big impact on the overall story. There are three major choices in particular, probably the biggest in the game, that I always find myself debating as to what the most desirable or realistic outcomes are. There are no real right or wrong answers, and that's the best thing about all this. Different endings have their pros and cons. What satisfies one player might completely frustrate the next. But for what it's worth, I'm going to take some time to talk through my personal thoughts about these three decisions. What is best for the world of The Witcher at large? What's best for the specific roster of characters involved? And then also what I think realistically would happen based on Geralt. When it comes to thinking about what Geralt would actually do as a character, it is important, I think, to consider each choice based on what he knows at the time in the story, without the foresight of knowing what the consequences of his choices are going to be. As the player, we obviously have the benefit of hindsight. We've played through all the options and we know how each story branch plays out. Obviously, Geralt doesn't. So it's important to consider his decisions based on the context of what's actually going on in the story at the time.
What's the problem?
Fuck! Another non-human! You're everywhere!
Let's start with the obvious debate, Geralt's future. The Witcher 3 is considered to be the end of Geralt's story regardless of the ending that you get. Whether he does pop up again somehow in The Witcher 4 remains to be seen. In terms of his ending, I love the idea of him and Ciri remaining on the path together as a father and daughter Witcher pairing. That's the first ending I ever got playing The Witcher 3, because I screwed my chances with Triss and Yennefer. Fortunately, I managed to get other choices right to ensure that Ciri at least survived at the end of the game. But when it comes to Geralt actually settling down with one of his love interests, I think Triss and Yennefer both have their own merits. The characters are so well written and developed, with personalities that couldn't be more different to one another. Yen's image and reputation is important to her. She hides her emotions a bit, she can be quite abrupt, selfish and almost unaffectionate at times.
Sometimes you really get on my nerves, you know.
But deep down there's a real sensitivity and softness that comes out every now and again, and I think that complements who Geralt is. They don't constantly have to be showering each other with affection to know how strong their bond is and to understand each other. Triss, on the other hand, is much more excitable, bubbly, wearing her emotions on her sleeve, probably putting all other people before herself. Arguably, she would treat Geralt a little bit more fairly in the relationship, and I think they'd be a lot more open and honest with one another, probably would argue a little bit less as well. But I think that Yen makes the most sense in terms of the overall lore and story, especially with the Last Wish and how that gets revisited in a side quest later in the game. I think the magic bond between Geralt and Yen was partly what made their relationship so tumultuous. Removing it will probably make things more normal between them.
So, feel any different after our encounter with the Djinn?
Yes. Now I feel regret.
Think we would have argued less?
Quite the opposite. But the other moments would have been more intense as well.
It is plausible that once the magic bond is gone, they might realise that what they had between them wasn't the real thing after all. But I'm a big softie at heart, and I think it's a far nicer way to just summarise and wrap up their overall story, that they realised their feelings for one another were genuine all along. But I'm not saying that things aren't well positioned for you to end up with Triss either. I just think that the way that the story is designed and the quest is set up makes it more natural for Geralt to gravitate towards Yen. Ultimately, of course, it does just come down to player preference, and I personally just think that Yen's overall personality is more suited to who Geralt is. But what about Ciri? Should she be the Empress of Nilfgaard or a Witcher? Both endings are considered positive, but I guess it really comes down to whether you want Ciri to be truly happy or whether you want what's best for the whole Witcher world and the population at large. It's heavily implied throughout the game that Ciri is getting a bit tired of all the fuss about her being so special, child of time and space, elder blood, etc. The life growing up with Geralt, the mages and Vesemir just feels more natural to her, given the freedom. She also favoured that lifestyle, and I think ultimately it's one that she's really destined for. I don't think you'd need to worry too much about her safety being a Witcher, given the powers that she's got, and the continued tutoring from Yennefer and Geralt. I think she'd just feel obliged to be Empress without really wanting to, and that is also heavily implied in Blood and Wine, where she says that she's having regrets about doing it. The two main choices that impact this ending are taking Ciri to the Emperor or not, and then who wins the war between Redania and Nilfgaard. Firstly, I think that Geralt would actually take Ciri to the Emperor. I think he'd want to empower Ciri to make her own choices about her real father and the life that he has intended for her. Geralt also has a moral code and is honourable, sticking by his word whenever he can. You could argue that if he was to put his morals and code aside for anyone, it would be Ciri, but he was told to find her by the Emperor, and I do think that he would honour that, especially given the threat of the Wild Hunt. He does need Ymir's help. Obviously Geralt has his own motivations for finding and protecting Ciri, but I do think he would take her, to give her the opportunity to hear him out and make her own choice about her future. One thing's for certain is that you should definitely be turning down the coin for doing it. It's not only a realistic thing for Geralt to do given how much he loves Ciri, but it's also a choice you need to make to help get a positive ending for her either way.
I understand. Honor prevents you from accepting coin.
If you take the coin, Ciri feels like she's been sold out or treated like an item to be traded, and it's one of the things that impacts her confidence and her overall ability to survive in the end. So if you do honour Geralt's word and you take Ciri to see the Emperor, what next? Well, I personally like to see Ciri become a Witcher, which means, unfortunately, it now comes down to an even tougher decision: Radovid. This crazed, bloodthirsty madman obviously deserves to die. But if you did take Ciri to see the Emperor and you still want her to become a Witcher, then you need to ensure that King Radovid lives and Redania wins the war, either by ignoring Triss when she requests help in rescuing the mages in Novigrad, which I just don't think Geralt as a character would do, or by ignoring Dijkstra's assassination plan once you hear about it afterwards. Doing either of these things locks out the option of Ciri becoming Empress. It doesn't totally eliminate the choice for her, I don't think, but it just doesn't happen out in this story branch. Perhaps with the fall of Nilfgaard's power, or because she just realises after all that it isn't what she wants to do, she just wants to be more normal. Here's where the hindsight thing I mentioned comes in. Some might think it's contradictory to take Ciri to the Emperor, opening up the possibility of her claiming her birthright, but then letting Radovid live so that he wins the war, but it's not actually a contradiction at all. Geralt couldn't possibly know that not getting involved with the assassination of the king would have such massive repercussions on the outcome of the war, and somehow have a knock-on effect on Ciri's decision-making or ability to become Empress. The only other way to ensure she becomes a Witcher is to proceed with the assassination of Radovid, but refuse to take Ciri to the Emperor in the first place, effectively denying her the opportunity of at least hearing her father out. I've already explained why I think the latter would be an uncharacteristic move for Geralt, and there's also no way he would refuse to help Triss rescue the mages, so he is going to hear about the assassination plot either way. But my opinion on that is I genuinely think Geralt would stick to his neutrality this time around. He's had his share of kings and politics, and I think this time he'd just want to let them take care of themselves, especially since he has the Wild Hunt to contend with, and that's going to be his primary focus. The quest entry with this decision makes so much sense too. I know that most of the quest entries throughout the game do kind of tailor themselves towards your actions, justifying them almost. But if you hear Dijkstra out about his assassination plan and then abandon it, I do think the quest entry is one of the more realistic ones. Geralt first courted high politics and then left them at the altar to fend for themselves while he saw to a more important matter, the fight against the Wild Hunt. If the Wild Hunt gets their hands on Ciri, they can use her power to launch a full-scale invasion that will threaten everybody, rendering much of the squabbling amongst kings kind of insignificant. It's a similar concept to Game of Thrones and the naivety in King's Landing over the White Walkers. Ultimately, compared to that threat, it really doesn't matter who sits on the throne. But as a player, if you do assassinate Radovid, of course you end up having to choose between Dijkstra and Roche, and it's not just the sudden and haphazard and abrupt way that the game handles this, it's the fact that I actually like both these characters, and I don't like to see either of them die. Roche is a really good friend to Geralt, and it just feels totally wrong to let them die at the hands of Dijkstra, but at the same time I don't particularly like having to kill Dijkstra either. He's a really clever and fascinating character with a lot of his own history with Geralt too. Whenever he's on screen it's just fantastic seeing them interact. While Dijkstra would never show it, he does hold a deep respect for Geralt. Yes, he's an absolute ass, and he'd double-cross you in a heartbeat if it suited him, but I do still like him. He has a similar dry, sarcastic way about him that Geralt does, and that's what leads to an underlying sense of humour whenever they talk to each other. Dijkstra's not all bad either. He does at least attempt to assist with the wild hunt, admitting that he couldn't come and fight because he's a lousy soldier, but he does give you a hefty dose of coin to help prepare if you manage to successfully find his treasure. If Radovid and Redania do win the war though, then Emir eventually gets murdered by his angered subjects. It's debatable as to whether he truly deserves that. He's a conqueror for sure, bringing war to the northern kingdoms, but he'd be a much better ruler than Radovid, who just wants to basically kill everyone. I do wonder whether Ciri would ever be safe if Emir lived. Not bringing her to the Emperor could incite a retaliation where he becomes even more determined to find her by force, using his armies for example, and that could put Geralt in harm's way. Overall, I think what's morally the best decision for the world, and some of the side characters admittedly, but definitely the general population, is that Radovid and Dijkstra both die, Ciri gets taken to the Emperor and decides to become Empress. She rules fairly over a new empire in a new era of prosperity, but sacrifices a bit of her personal happiness in the process. Probably won't be able to see very much of Geralt either, especially as long as Emir is alive. However, what I think is far better for most of the characters, and is arguably the most realistic outcome, is that Geralt tells Ciri about the Emperor and takes her to him, for her own sake, not Emir's, but abandons any plans to see the assassination of Radovid through in order to focus priorities on the wild hunt. Dijkstra and Roche then live to carry on doing whatever it is they do. Ciri decides against becoming Empress, choosing the Witcher life that she's been trained for. She sets out on the path, meanwhile Geralt settles down with Yen. That does unfortunately mean Radovid can continue his mad killing spree, but at least most of the main characters are all safe, for now. But there is a third option, which I really think is probably the most desirable outcome. It's kind of the best of both worlds, and that's telling Ciri about the Emperor's search for her, but discouraging her from going to see him. If you choose that dialogue option, Geralt doesn't outright tell her not to, he just points out that it's unlikely he just misses his daughter, instead probably has some sort of motive or agenda, some sort of plan for her. That frustrates Ciri, and then she makes her own choice to shun her father. You can then happily get away with giving Radovid what he deserves, and because you've avoided taking Ciri to Nilfgaard, she never gets presented with the idea of being Empress. Still depriving her a little bit, you could say, but at least Geralt has done the right thing by at least mentioning it to her and allowing her to make the choice for herself. Much better than just ignoring the issue entirely. The best thing about all this though, as I've said before, is that there's no right or wrong. I really enjoy reading about what other people think should or would happen. Ultimately, it's entirely up to you. If you don't like the way things ended up on a playthrough, you can just start the game again like I did and do things differently. What are your thoughts? Have I been talking absolute crap, or do you think these decisions make sense? Who do you prefer rules over the Empire, and what should the real futures for Geralt and Ciri hold? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, well, I'm glad. Thank you for watching.